You've probably had this experience, even if you've never had the language for it. A conversation with your partner ends, and you walk away feeling strange. Not angry exactly, not hurt in any obvious way you could point to and explain, just off, slightly foggy, a little unsure of what actually just happened, even though you were the one standing there the entire time. You replay the conversation later, trying to pin down the exact moment things shifted, and you can't quite find it. Nothing was said that sounds bad out loud, and yet something in you feels smaller than it did an hour ago, and you don't know why. If this sounds familiar, what you're describing isn't confusion without a cause. It's a response to something real, something that operates specifically because it doesn't announce itself. Emotional manipulation, in most relationships where it actually happens, doesn't look like the dramatic scenes we see in movies. It doesn't come with raised voices or obvious cruelty. It comes quietly, disguised as concern, as love, as reasonable disagreement. And that disguise is exactly what makes it so difficult to name, even when you're the one living inside its effects every single day. Today, we're going to walk through the signs of this kind of manipulation, the quiet ones, the ones that don't look like anything is wrong on the surface. And by the end, you'll have language for something you may have been sensing for a long time without being able to explain it. This isn't about diagnosing your partner, it's about learning to trust the fog you've been feeling, because that fog, it turns out, is one of the most reliable pieces of information you have. Let's start with the most common and least understood sign, because it's the one almost everyone experiences without recognizing it for what it is: the slow erosion of your own certainty. This doesn't happen through a single dramatic event. It happens through repetition, small moment after small moment, where your account of something gets subtly, gently contested. You remember a conversation one way, and your partner remembers it differently. And instead of two people comparing memories, it becomes something closer to a negotiation over whose memory is going to be treated as accurate. Over time, and this is the part that matters most, you start entering these conversations already braced for your own memory to be wrong. You start qualifying your own statements before anyone even challenges them. I might be misremembering, but I could be wrong about this, but this isn't humility. This is a nervous system that has learned, through repeated experience, that trusting its own account of events tends to lead to conflict, so it starts preemptively surrendering that trust before conflict even has a chance to begin. This pattern has a name that gets used a lot online, often incorrectly, so let's be precise about what it actually means. True psychological gaslighting isn't just disagreeing with someone or having a different memory of an event, which happens naturally in every relationship. It specifically involves a consistent, repeated pattern where one person's version of reality gets treated as more valid than the others, regardless of the actual facts, until the person on the receiving end starts doubting their own perception as a matter of habit rather than as a response to any specific evidence. The tell isn't a single disagreement. It's the accumulated pattern of always being the one who ends up uncertain, always being the one who apologizes for misremembering, even when, if you actually went back and checked, your version turns out to have been accurate all along. Let's talk about a second sign, one that's especially insidious because it wears the mask of vulnerability: the strategic deployment of hurt feelings to redirect accountability. Picture this scenario, because it plays out in relationships everywhere, with only minor variations in the specific details. You bring up something that upset you. Maybe your partner was dismissive of something important to you, or broke a promise, or said something that landed harder than they probably intended. Before you can even finish explaining how it affected you, your partner's face changes, their voice drops, and suddenly they're the one who's hurt. Hurt that you would even bring this up. Hurt that you don't see how hard they're trying. Hurt that you're always focusing on the negative instead of appreciating everything they do. Within minutes, something remarkable and completely disorienting has happened. The conversation that started with your legitimate concern has transformed into you comforting them. Your original issue, whatever it was, simply evaporates, unaddressed, buried under the weight of their performed injury. And here's what makes this pattern so effective, so difficult to interrupt even when you can see it happening in real time. It exploits exactly the qualities that make you a caring, empathetic partner in the first place. You don't want to hurt someone you love. You don't want to be the kind of person who keeps pushing when someone tells you they're in pain. So you back off, you soothe, you reassure, and the actual issue you raised goes back into the same drawer it always goes into, unresolved, waiting to resurface again the next time it becomes too much to ignore. This is worth naming clearly because it's one of the most common patterns in these relationships and one of the least discussed with any real precision. Emotional redirection isn't the same as genuine vulnerability, even though it can look remarkably similar in the moment. Genuine vulnerability, when a partner is actually hurt by something you've said, typically exists alongside continued engagement with your original point, not instead of it. Let's go deeper into how that fog actually forms, because understanding its mechanics changes how you relate to it entirely. Confusion in these dynamics isn't a side effect of manipulation. It's often the actual goal, whether or not the manipulating partner would ever describe it that way to themselves. A confused partner is a partner who's constantly seeking clarity, and someone constantly seeking clarity is, almost by definition, oriented toward the person they believe can provide it. If you're perpetually unsure whether you're remembering things correctly, whether your feelings are proportionate, whether you're being too sensitive or not understanding enough, you end up spending enormous amounts of energy trying to resolve that uncertainty. And the person you're most likely to turn to for resolution is the very person who created the uncertainty in the first place. This creates a closed loop that's remarkably difficult to escape from the inside, because the source of the confusion and the apparent solution to it are the same person. This is where we need to talk about a pattern that rarely gets discussed with real precision: the difference between confusion that resolves and confusion that compounds. Healthy relationships produce confusion sometimes too. Everyone misunderstands each other occasionally. Everyone has moments of not quite knowing what a partner meant by something. But healthy confusion tends to resolve through conversation. You ask, you get a relatively direct answer, and even if the answer isn't what you hoped for, the uncertainty itself lifts. In manipulative dynamics, confusion tends to compound instead. You ask for clarity and receive something that sounds like an answer, but somehow leaves you more uncertain than before you asked. The explanation doesn't quite add up, but it's delivered with enough confidence, enough emotional weight, or enough length and complexity that questioning it further starts to feel unreasonable, even though the actual content never resolved anything. This compounding confusion often shows up in a specific, recognizable pattern worth naming directly: answers that technically respond to your question without actually addressing it. You ask why they didn't text you back for 6 hours, and instead of a direct answer, you get an explanation about how busy their day was, how much pressure they're under, how they can't believe you'd question something so small when they're dealing with so much. Every individual sentence sounds reasonable, but when you step back and look at the whole response, your original question, why didn't you respond, was never actually answered. What you received instead was a redirection dressed up as an answer, thorough enough and emotional enough that noticing the redirection in the moment feels almost impossible. Let's talk about another subtle sign worth naming clearly, one that many people experience without ever connecting it to manipulation specifically: the sensation of being perpetually almost understood. This is different from not being understood at all, which is at least clear and identifiable as a problem. This is subtler and more disorienting. Your partner seems to grasp what you're saying, responds in ways that acknowledge your words, and yet something about their response never quite lands as genuine comprehension. It's as if they've learned the shape of empathy without absorbing its actual function. They can say the right words. I hear you. That makes sense. I understand why you'd feel that way, but these phrases arrive without producing any actual change in behavior afterward. The understanding, if that's even the right word for it, exists only as long as the conversation does, and evaporates the moment the conversation ends, leaving the same pattern to repeat again almost immediately. This particular sign deserves special attention because it's one of the most confusing to identify from the inside, precisely because it involves your partner saying all the things a genuinely understanding partner would say. You can't point to a specific sentence and say, this proves manipulation because no individual sentence is wrong. What reveals the pattern is the complete absence of follow through, the total disconnect between verbal acknowledgement and actual behavioral change. If you find yourself having the same conversation, almost word for word, every few weeks or months, always receiving understanding sounding responses, always seeing zero corresponding shift in the actual behavior being discussed, that repetition is the sign, not any single conversation within it. Now let's talk about something rarely discussed with enough honesty: the specific role that intelligence and articulateness play in making certain kinds of manipulation especially difficult to recognize. There's a common assumption that manipulative behavior comes from people who are somehow less thoughtful, less self aware, less articulate than their partners. In reality, some of the most effective emotional manipulation comes from people who are highly intelligent and verbally skilled, because that skill allows them to construct explanations that sound coherent, even sophisticated, regardless of whether those explanations actually correspond to what happened. A partner who can talk fluently about their own psychology, who can reference their childhood, their attachment style, their personal growth journey, can use that fluency to make almost any behavior sound like it makes sense within some larger, more understandable context, even when the behavior itself remains genuinely harmful. This is worth naming directly because it produces a specific kind of confusion many people struggle to articulate even to themselves: the feeling of being outmatched intellectually in conversations about your own emotional experience. If your partner can always produce a more sophisticated explanation than you can counter in the moment, always frame things in language that sounds more psychologically informed than your own reaction, you start to feel like the less credible narrator of your own life, purely because they're better at constructing arguments than you are at trusting your own direct experience. This dynamic has nothing to do with who's actually right. Articulateness isn't the same as accuracy, and a well-constructed explanation for harmful behavior is still an explanation for harmful behavior. But in the moment, when someone is speaking with fluent confidence about their own inner workings, it's remarkably easy to mistake that fluency for validity. Let's move to a sign that operates almost entirely beneath conscious awareness for most people experiencing it: the shrinking of your own opinions before you've even voiced them. This develops gradually, so gradually that most people don't notice the shrinking happening in real time. Early in a relationship, you might have strong, clearly stated opinions about all kinds of things: where to eat, how to spend a weekend, what you think about a decision your partner is facing. Over time, in relationships shaped by emotional manipulation, these opinions often start arriving pre-softened, hedged, wrapped in qualifiers before anyone has even had a chance to disagree with them. I don't really care, but maybe it's totally fine either way, though I guess if I had to choose. This isn't a personality trait. It's a learned adaptation, developed because stating a clear opinion, at some point, led often enough to friction, dismissal, or an exhausting negotiation that it eventually became easier to preemptively minimize the opinion before offering it at all. This shrinking is worth taking seriously as a genuine sign, not a personal failing, because of how it develops. Nobody starts a relationship already speaking in hedges and qualifiers about things they actually care about. This pattern gets built, interaction by interaction, specifically in response to an environment where directness has proven costly. If you find yourself in this specific relationship, expressing far fewer clear opinions than you do in every other area of your life, with friends, at work, in decisions that don't involve your partner at all. That discrepancy is worth paying attention to. It's rarely a coincidence, and it's almost never simply about you becoming a more agreeable person. Let's talk about that shift directly, because it's the turning point everything in this exploration has been building toward. The moment you stop searching for a single, undeniable piece of evidence and start trusting the pattern you've actually been living inside all along. This shift matters enormously because so many people stay stuck in these dynamics, specifically because they're waiting for proof dramatic enough to justify what they already feel. They want a moment they can point to and say, there, that's the smoking gun. That's the thing that finally makes leaving or confronting or even just naming this out loud feel legitimate. But manipulation of this kind, the quiet, subtle kind we've spent this entire exploration examining, almost never produces a single smoking gun. It produces 1,000 small moments, none dramatic enough on their own to serve as proof, all of them together forming a pattern unmistakable in its consistency. Waiting for the dramatic version means waiting for something that may never arrive, while the actual evidence, the pattern itself, has been sitting in plain sight the entire time. This is why the most important skill in recognizing this kind of manipulation isn't detective work. It's something quieter and in some ways more difficult. Learning to treat your own accumulated felt sense as legitimate data, rather than requiring it to be justified by some external, undeniable proof before you're allowed to trust it. That foggy, uncertain feeling you started this exploration with, the one you couldn't quite name or explain, was never actually meaningless. It was information, gathered by a part of you that was paying attention long before your conscious mind had language for what it was noticing. Learning to trust that information doesn't require you to catch your partner in an obvious lie. It only requires you to stop discounting your own experience simply because you can't yet articulate every detail of why it feels the way it does. Now let's talk about what actually changes once this trust starts to rebuild, because this is where real movement becomes possible. The first thing that shifts is usually the smallest and most private. You start noticing the patterns in real time rather than only in retrospect. Where you used to walk away from a confusing conversation and only recognize the redirection hours or days later, you start catching it as it happens, mid-conversation, a small internal flag going up that says, "This is happening again." This doesn't necessarily change your behavior in the moment right away. Recognition and response are two different skills, and recognition almost always develops first. But recognition, even without an immediate change in how you respond, is genuinely significant because it means the fog is starting to lift. You're no longer only living inside the confusion. You're beginning to watch it form, and something that can be watched rather than simply endured starts to lose some of its power over you. The second thing that changes, usually somewhat later, is your relationship with your own hedging. Remember the shrinking opinions we discussed, the qualifiers added before anyone has even had a chance to disagree. As trust in your own perception rebuilds, you start noticing those hedges as they form in real time too, and noticing them creates an opportunity, even a small one, to choose differently. Recognizing this doesn't mean every difficult relationship is manipulative, and it doesn't mean every moment of confusion or disagreement is evidence of something sinister. Relationships are genuinely complicated, and everyone brings imperfection into them. But there's a meaningful difference between the ordinary friction of two imperfect people learning to understand each other and a consistent pattern where one person's reality, one person's feelings, one person's need for stability quietly and repeatedly takes precedence over the others. Learning to tell these apart isn't about becoming suspicious of every partner or every disagreement. It's about finally trusting the specific, accumulated weight of your own experience, rather than requiring a single dramatic moment to grant yourself permission to trust what you've already been sensing. If you've recognized pieces of your own relationship somewhere in this exploration, here's what's worth holding on to above everything else we've discussed today. The fog you've been feeling was never proof that something was wrong with you, your perception, or your ability to understand your own relationship clearly. It was information, communicated the only way this particular kind of harm knows how to communicate, quietly, cumulatively, without ever leaving a single obvious mark you could point to and say, there, that's the problem. You don't need a single undeniable moment to justify what you already know. You need only what you've already been carrying. The pattern itself, lived and felt across enough time that its shape has become unmistakable, whether or not you've had the words for it until now. Trust that shape. It was never asking too much of your relationship to expect clarity instead of confusion, consistency instead of conditional warmth, and understanding that shows up in behavior, not just in well-chosen words. That expectation was never unreasonable. It was simply, finally, yours to reclaim. Thanks for watching.